So The Hill Rising is a show that was popularized by the Crystal and Sagar iteration of the series. You guys might remember it. It was right-wing populists versus left-wing populists. However, they moved on to do the Breaking Points podcast, and then the show continued with a new cast of character. Now, representing the left wing, we have Briahna Joy Gray, somebody who we've touched on this channel a couple of different times, who's absolutely ridiculous in terms of how progressive she is. And on the opposition, we have Robby Soave, who is a libertarian. And much like the previous iteration of the show, it appears, for whatever reason, that Briahna seems to have the upper hand in these conversations, a la Hannity and Combs, except this time Combs is the winner over Hannity, which never happened on the original Fox News version. And honestly, it's kind of amazing how many lies Briahna can just say and repeat and perpetuate on this show with very little pushback. Even when Robby is correct on his pushback and he says the correct thing, she just steamrolls him. So credit to my friend Clinton for sending me over this clip. It's related to the whole Elon Musk comparing Soros to Magneto thing, and I would have never watched this before, but having watched it, having heard what was said in this ridiculous conversation, we have to debunk and smash all of it. But before we get into that, I want to say thank you to everybody who signed up over on my website, actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money, okay?
And to the people who listen to this show via Apple's podcasting platform, Spotify, and now Google Podcasts. Links for all are in the description. Go find me over there and subscribe.
Elon Musk picked a fight with George Soros and made an interesting comment about Soros. He called him Magneto, the comic book supervillain. I'm definitely going to talk more about that to Briahna's utter delight. So this is very interesting because Magneto is specifically a Jewish supervillain. Magneto's backstory is that he's a Holocaust survivor. So Magneto's from the X-Men. He's a villain in the X-Men. It was great. But people are saying that Musk basically did an anti-Semitism. Right. Which, that's a little preposterous.
So first and foremost, I do appreciate Robby setting the tone that this is probably a reach to label this anti-Semitic just because Magneto happens to be an actual Holocaust survivor in the comic books and in the movies, and George Soros is somebody who escaped the Holocaust, and therefore this should have been seen by Musk as a weird, anti-Semitic parallel or anything like that. Also, I do want to point out that Magneto is a fantastic character, way more interesting than George Soros in reality, and honestly, I'm not on Elon Musk's side comparing one of my favorite characters in the cinematic run of X-Men to George Soros. I mean, come on, do better than that. Don't give him the most badass character in comic book movies, or one of the most badass characters. Compare him to someone else, somebody way lamer.
I agree. It's not a direct reading, right? But even folks who are more conservative aligned, Radley Balco, who formerly of Reason Magazine, tweeted that, look, I've worked for 2 co-funded groups and no Soros-funded groups, and that this tweet is seriously effed up. Musk is tossing slabs of red meat to the most deranged, dangerous factions of the right, and it's looking less like opportunism and more like he's just one of them. People have put this in concert with other changes on the site, a lack of moderation that has allowed certain kind of hate group speak to proliferate, and maybe you think that's fine.
Allegedly. I don't know how borne out that is, but...
All right.
Okay.
So yeah, you have a lot of people saying that Elon Musk is playing to the right wing, which, by the way, I do feel like he is doing so in such a way because Elon Musk could have more influence on American politics if he wanted to by funding a larger network of affiliated groups, yet he's just talking about George Soros on Twitter. But I do appreciate Robby right there in that moment pushing back against this narrative of Twitter just becoming infinitely more anti-Semitic or infinitely more hateful post Elon Musk taking over. This was something that was just asserted out there in the public from the jump as something that was statistically proven, but no, it's not the case, and Briahna obviously not happy even with that mild amount of pushback, so she says, oh no, maybe you think that's fine, and he's like, no, it's not really, there's no evidence of that, that's still alleged, and she's very upset by that. I happen to agree. I think this is dramatically overstated, but again, Briahna is somebody in favor of censoring speech she disagrees with, so maybe she's interacting more with people that she disagrees with. Fun fact, by the way, she actually blocked me on Twitter for quote tweeting her related to black crime or something that she was lying about, so obviously we know how she feels about political speech that she is not aligned with.
And combined with some of his other tweeting patterns, who he responds to, the kind of tweets he's been liking, he tweeted out some memes about black on black crime and certain other kind of tropes that were factually inaccurate. There's like this edited
Are they
graph.
factually inaccurate?
Yeah, because I think it's 85% of black crime is against black people, 83% of white crime is against white people, and then there's the outliers that are very much lower. And there's a graph that cuts off those huge chunks of same on same crime to make it seem as though the most prevalent kind of crime is black on white crime, and that kind of crime is underreported.
My understanding is the graph is only about crimes committed by one racial group against another.
There's an edited graph.
So this is the beginning of the series of lies put out by Briahna Greyjoy that just show you that A, she's either in a bubble or she's just factually lying about what was going on. Because the meme in question was specifically, as Robby said, again, credit to him, even though he should push back stronger, about interracial crime. As you can see, it is a comparison between different groups offending against different groups. And by the way, this is not my speculation or anything like that. This is what Elon Musk specifically responded to. So this is what Briahna is referencing in terms of what Elon responded to.
One racial group against another.
There's an edited graph that people have been sharing around. And so that's what people are saying is misleading. Like, you can say that that's fine, but that's, it's an edited graph.
And what this meme is attempting to show is the fact that the media only seems to focus on, comparatively, white on black crimes, which are actually amongst the most rarest of the crimes that we see according to this chart, rather than the much larger number of black on white crimes. And her whole thing about how 85% of crimes are committed by blacks on blacks and 83% are committed by white on white.
Because I think it's 85% of black crime is against black people, 83% of white crime is against white people, and then there's the outliers that are very much lower.
It's just false. First of all, she's referring to murder specifically there, and this chart is actually not referring to murder at all. It's actually talking about crimes as reported from the National Crime Victimization Survey, which does not cover homicide, and even then, that is inaccurate. In fact, I can actually break out the chart for you guys so that you can see that black offenders tend to impact white people way more disproportionately, and even according to this victimization survey for this year, more than they impact black victims. Now, to be clear, in terms of the homicide statistics, we tend to see that black victims 91% of the time are killed by black perpetrators, and white victims 83% of the time are killed by white perpetrators, and we see similar kind of numbers across all racial groups because murder is typically done between people who know one another, so obviously we're going to see that more disproportionately, but she just tried to broaden it out and try to apply overall victimization to the narrow constraints of homicide and claim that this chart, which only talks about interracial crime, somehow cuts out intraracial crime when that's just not the case. Robby, again, push back a little stronger because this was an obvious lie.
One racial group against another.
There's an edited graph that people have been sharing around. And so that's what people are saying is misleading. Like, you can say that that's fine, but that's, it's an edited graph.
Again, it's not an edited graph. It is interracial crime. It says it right there on the top. It makes it clear what we're talking about. It is not overall crime or overall victimization. We have no like-on-like groups in this graph. Now, you can look at these other charts that I found, one that talks about overall victimization from the same year of the National Crime Victimization Survey, and you can see those numbers as well. And you can see the side-by-side interracial, which is what this chart posted by N Wokeness is actually drawing from. And you can also see, by the way, that Asians versus blacks are completely cut out of the N Wokeness chart. So if you're going to say it's edited in that way, then sure, but I don't think Briahna wants to highlight this, because what you find out is that Asians victimizing blacks is actually 99 times less likely than blacks victimizing Asians. But in terms of this graph being edited or portrayed in a misleading way, it's just not the case.
Look, you're not a crazy conspiracy theorist or an anti-Semitic or a hateful person if you disagree. You can disagree with George Soros' policies. Mm-hmm. I probably agree with some of them and disagree with others. And he has massive influence. He spends tons of money helping to elect people who support his policies. I think that's his right to do. You might actually disagree. I think that's totally fine within the realm of how campaigns are conducted. But you can complain about his. It doesn't make you an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist to think his influence is bad or not want him to have this level of influence, or think that the policies that he's trying to achieve are not good. Certainly, some people who criticize him going too far, and we've seen the anti-Semitic memes, that kind of stuff. There's an element of that, but substantially the criticism of him is a criticism of the priorities he has. And I'm not even saying I share that criticism, but and then Additionally, with this tweet specifically, just because this character has a Jewish origin doesn't mean comparing. I mean, George Soros also, right, has a Holocaust origin.
He survived the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So honestly, I really like Robby's stance right here, because what he's essentially saying is that if you have money, it is your right to spend that money to talk and promote political issues that you want. Now, we're not talking about direct contributions to politicians. A lot of people tend to conflate the campaign finance limits for politicians with overall spending, and in this regard, I completely agree with him. And he also makes sure to make the delineation between the people who are pointing out that George Soros is doing this because he's factually doing this, versus the people who are saying that this is some grand Jewish conspiracy, which would be in the more ridiculous category. Elon Musk is talking about George Soros spending money in politics, again, because he spends money in politics, much in the same way that people on the left have no problem or had no problem calling out Sheldon Adelson, also a Jewish person who spent money in politics, or the Koch brothers, who I don't believe are Jewish, but they're the owners of the largest private corporation in the United States of America, or many of these other wealthy people who are interested in political issues, and thus they spend money on those political issues. Remember, Betsy DeVos, who is the education secretary, was a billionaire who was really passionate and interested in charter schools and school choice, and people pointed that out nonstop when Trump appointed her to be the head of the Department of Education.
So, for example, he's been responding a lot to this End Wokeness account that was tweeting this, tweeting about how, why don't we know more? Why does it seem that we know so much about the shooters when they are shooters who are kind of right-leaning, but not anything about certain other shooters, like the trans shooters that may or may not be left-leaning, right? Like, we don't know very much about that person.
Well, haven't we ourselves asked that very question?
Sure, but the last part of the tweet is that he's responding to is Hispanic male shoots at mall and kills several white people one day later. White supremacy. Well, that's not exactly conjecture.
So Briahna's talking about how, he brought up this point. Robby gives a little bit of pushback there. And then she just says it's not conjecture that the Latino shooter in Texas being referenced was a white supremacist, even though it definitely is. I've gone through the writings. There's all this talk about like how Aztecs or people of Aztec descent, which are in Mexico, are the superior group. And the Nazi tattoos show a strain of neo-Nazism, but not necessarily white supremacism. Typically, when you deal with these minorities that happen to be neo-Nazis, their primary hatred group happens to be Jewish people, then followed by other ancillary groups. So what we can see is that this person has some neo-Nazi affiliations, the love for Nazi iconography so far, that's what's out in the public, and not necessarily is a white supremacist. So yes, that is a giant leap, and it's one of the things that annoys me because I used to design graduate courses, or I was on a team that helped design graduate courses on extremism. The fact that people can't seem to delineate between groups like the Klan, like the neo-Nazis, like white nationalists, even though they do have distinct beliefs that separate themselves from one another. This is like not knowing the difference, in my opinion, between Shia extremists or Sunni extremists. Like, obviously, there are different organizations that fall under those broader umbrellas, and just asserting that they're all Muslims does not help us know specifically what's going on, nor does it explain why somebody who's allegedly a white supremacist appears to have gone to a white area to conduct this crime.
Nor did it take a rocket scientist to come to the conclusion that that guy was a white supremacist, given that he had enormous swastika tattoos all over his body. So what is the implication of Elon Musk responding to that tweet? Odd. Is it odd that the news would report that a man with swastika tattoos shot a bunch of people, and that swastika tattoos are literally the sign of Nazism and white supremacy?
Well, again, swastikas are the sign of neo-Nazism in modern-day America, but they're not necessarily the sign of white supremacy. There are black people who unfortunately embrace these symbols because they don't like Jewish people. This is usually a good indicator that somebody's anti-Semitic, and then you draw your own parallels. And typically, if they're a white person, you can pretty much categorize them as also being a white supremacist, but there are delineations, especially specifically when we're talking about the non-white groups of neo-Nazis, like it seems like the shooter in this instance was affiliated from. But again, no nuance in there, nothing like that, and no acknowledgement of the fact that the reason they're running with that narrative and blasting it in every headline is because it already lines up with the preconceived notions of the media.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's often I agree with what you just said. There's often a kernel, or more than a kernel, of a good idea or an intriguing idea or something that bears further investigation in some of these observations, like that, like the media's greater interest in some of the mass shooters and seeming lack of interest in the one that might have gone counter to their usual playing favorites teams kind of thing is interesting, and we are a little more curious about that. And then you can take that too far and start to go into conspiracy territory. And that's, I mean, I wish Elon would hold himself back a little bit, I guess. But, he's his own person. He's bought Twitter. He can make it his playground.
Yeah. Look, Robby has good points throughout this. If you listen to him, if you actually take into account what he's saying. However, I need this man to speak with a little bit more oomph. I need him to push back a little stronger, because you have Briahna saying untrue thing after untrue thing over and over and over again. And then he meekly corrects the issue. Then she gives him a look and he's head down, not really paying attention. Come on, Robby. This is a two-person show, allegedly. Why don't you stick up for the side that you're trying to argue instead of meekly saying, well, yeah, I understand that, and let me look down and not make direct eye contact and kind of wussily say my position. You actually have solid information on your side. You're actually addressing, at least in a non-straw man way, the points that people are making about the varying coverage and the varying levels of revealing information to the public about these two instances. And I wish you would actually say so like you were correct. One of the things I hate is when you're in an argument and the person who's correct is well, I'm just going to be calm and talk about it. And the other person is asserting dominance over the conversation and that person's wrong. Yet most people think the opposite just based on the body language.
For example, in response to the protesters following the Neely death on the subway, there were a bunch of people occupying the subway tracks that were protesting for Penny to be charged. He had not been charged at that time. And Elon Musk asked this refrain that many conservatives have been asking: why didn't they protest the children who were murdered at the Christian school? They are disingenuous. And so again, there's this framing of, somehow they're out to get Christianity.
So apparently you have people talking about how there wasn't enough outrage over the Christian school or whatever, but there's all this outrage over Neely. I think these are bad one-to-one comparisons. In fact, you can compare very similar instances of black people killing white people, or even more unjustified instances of black people killing white people for racist reasons. Like we have the group of people who actually went around and shot somebody fixing a mailbox and told the police that they did so because they wanted to kill a white person. You have the black person who reportedly killed two white people because of racist reasons, and that gets no attention. However, the mere fact that Daniel Penny was a white person, who, by the way, actually conducted himself with a minority of Hispanic descent, it appears, and a black person in the restraint of Neely, people are saying that he's a racist and only him specifically is going to be charged. But what I find incredibly interesting is where Briahna ends up taking this, which is all these white attacks and all this nonsense, and she's kind of emphasizing this point, even though we know about these attacks because the perpetrator was white. That's why they got the national attention. So she's actually playing into it, but then she goes into a much more sinister direction.
How many black churches were gunned down by white supremacists? How many synagogues have been gunned down by white supremacists? Sikhs have been attacked by white supremacists. And there are protests when the perpetrator is not killed on the scene and is not arrested, or is arrested but treated very well. The way that, Dylan Roof, who was taken to Burger King and escorted so gently, it seemed, to the car.
So this is where we could have used Robby Soave to push back against Briahna Joy Gray, because what she just told is a vicious lie being perpetuated by the media about the treatment of one Dylan Roof. And I'm going to break it down for you, even though I've done an entire video on it. Now, for those of you who are unaware, Dylan Roof was somebody, a white nationalist, white supremacist, whatever you want to call him, who shot up a historically black church in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, he ended up fleeing the scene of that area without getting arrested, but he was eventually stopped in his vehicle by the Shelby County Police Department, or Sheriff's Department, in North Carolina, and they were guns drawn, they knew who he was, and Dylan surrendered immediately and was not killed. Now, this is standard. If they don't pose a threat at the time that they're surrendering, and you show up, you know who they are, you have all the guns trained on him, that this person is taken alive. There have been plenty of black people taken alive for various similar instances. It's not that rare. There's entire threads about how ridiculous this is. However, one of the things that's interesting about the Shelby Sheriff's Department is that they're an incredibly small town sheriff's department. In fact, they don't even have their own jail. And because they don't have their own jail, they also don't have their own meal services. So they took Dylan Roof, this high-profile inmate, to their station and held him there before the FBI was going to pick him up. However, during the course of time that they had custody of Roof, he said that he was hungry. Now, if you aren't aware of this, it's actually considered a civil rights violation, and it could be something that is used to get rid of certain statements that you would make to the police if the suspect was under duress. And one of the ways that you can be under duress is if you are not hungry. So when Dylan was at the station that didn't have a jail, that didn't have meal services, and he said that he was hungry, the decision was made to go somewhere close, which, by the way, Burger King, if you look it up, 5 minutes away, to get him something for cheap so that they can feed him, so that you don't end up with a situation where anything Dylan Roof said to the police was not something that they could use in the ultimate trial to convict him. So what you ended up happening was an instance of the Shelby police perfectly following protocol with a high-profile inmate in order to make sure that they weren't the small-town department that you hear about that bungled such a high-profile case. They did everything by the book, yet you have Briahna Joy-Gray talking about it as if they took him to Burger King and bought him a nice meal, as if to imply that the Shelby Sheriff's Department in North Carolina is somehow on the side of Dylan Roof. So you have this department that understands the gravity of the suspect, understands how serious it is doing everything to follow protocol, and you have the left wing who ignores that. They take an excerpt out, they exaggerate it, and make it sound like they brought him to Burger King, maybe let him play in the ball pit or something, in order to give you this idea that this person that everyone is against, that the Sheriff's Department followed protocol perfectly, that they took with the utmost seriousness, was actually somehow aligned with Roof. That white people in the police department saw what Roof did and they said, wow, you're such a good guy, we're on your team in some way, let's hook you up for a meal because we kind of agree with what you did. It's one of the nastiest, most sinister things that the left wing has put out about the Roof case, a case that everyone is against, that everyone understands how evil this freaking guy was in his actions, yet they can't ever unite. They have to figure out a way to divide, and the way that they do that is by exaggerating, lying, pulling stuff out of context, and putting it out into the public. Imagine being the Shelby Police Department or the Shelby Sheriff's Department, doing everything right, and years later, you're still being lied about consistently on the internet about it. And while I gave Robby credit for actually pushing back in other instances, this was a key moment where actually knowing your information, knowing you're sitting across from an absolute liar, would have been crucial. It's absolutely shameful that we're still dealing with this nonsense right here in this moment, but again, that's what we're dealing with.
Well, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I think the media specifically, like how much attention we give, right, like, yes, the Jordan Neely, regardless of how you feel about it. The choice to make this as big a story from a media perspective involves some decision-making from media actors, sure, where, you know, how many, crime stories have we covered in the last month or so where more people die or it's random, it's horrifying, kids gunned down. Some of those big national news got a lot of coverage. A lot of them didn't get nearly as much coverage as this.
And you just see the pushback from Robby in this moment. It's so much weaker than it needs to be. The choice to make this and it deals with the highlights or whatever. No conversation about how they're playing the 13-year-old clips of this guy dancing like Michael Jackson. No conversation about how 3 people assisted in this restraint, thus are all chargeable, yet only one person's being charged, and that's the white person, and everybody seems to be okay with that selective prosecution. Nothing about how Eric Adams was talking about how Jordan Neely was like him specifically, and he was one of us, as in a black person, and how he named his son Jordan.
My fellow New Yorkers, this has been a week of strong emotions in our city. One of our own is dead. A black man, black like me. A man named Jordan. The name I gave my son.
Just the weakest, meekest pushback about how, the media sometimes likes to highlight things that they want to talk about. But come on, do better than that.
Uneven nature of that can cause you to question, well, why? Yeah. And is it because it speaks to something like what happened to Jordan Neely speaks to the political or the policy views of the people making decisions in media?
I think some of that is true. I also think, frankly, there are so many, most gun crimes happen like in urban areas, gang violence and things like that don't get very, very widely reported on. And there's an implication that, well, no one cares about black on black crime. We're only reporting on interracial crime because it's galvanizing and it confirms one narrative or the other.
Right.
I do think there's some of that, but I think a lot of it is that we report on crime that makes us feel implicated as more affluent people.
Now, because Robby gave such weak and meek pushback against Briahna Greyjoy, she ends up closing out this segment more or less with saying, well, the reason that we don't talk about urban crime is not because we don't want to talk about in the media black on black crime, the actual problems going on with the black community or anything like that. It's because of a class issue and the media's upper class. So she gets to frame this in this way, even though she knows for sure that the reason she's highlighting this case but not that case is so that she could forward her own racial narrative. Again, this is one of the reasons why I can't stand this show, because Robby will say a lot of correct things, but he never really has his voice actually expressed on these issues. It's always the meekest pushback with like, oh, I half agree with you and all of that. So the takeaway from the audience, if you just sat somebody down, is that Briahna is more correct than him, even though she's lying and telling vicious lies, like smearing the Shelby Sheriff's Department as somehow aligned with Dylan Roof, when all they did was make sure that this highly important case was handled according to protocol. It's shameful, it's disgusting, of course, it is something that just gets perpetuated throughout all our society. It's not the only example of this, but I'm sick of it, and this video was particularly bad. Little did I know that a video about Elon Musk calling George Soros Magneto would turn into a whole hatchet job against conservatives, the right wing, strawmanning statistics, denying crime, and smearing a good sheriff's department for a job well done. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about a ridiculous Hill Rising segment. Till next time.